right, everybody, good morning. Going live with another reading hour. It's for July 10th, 2025. Just give Instagram a second to catch up here, and then we'll get started. Why is it taking so long? That's why. Sorry, folks. All right, now it's working. Sorry about that. All right, now without further ado, let's get started on the Gladio book. So when we last left off, we were talking about Friar Bergoglio and all of the atrocities that he was responsible for, that he knowingly sent people to these torture and death camps to endure. And I speculated that this next section, called Bergoglio Triumphant, would probably mean that he was never held accountable for any of these things. So this next section here is Bergoglio Triumphant. On March 13th, 2013, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio ascended to the throne of St. Peter as Pope Francis I. The nagging questions about his background may never receive a satisfactory answer, nor will concerns that the CIA manipulated the election as it had in the past with Juan Perón. Or I think that may be Perón in a typo. Argentine journalists and scholars with insight into the agency's activities in their country already have labeled Bergoglio, quote, Washington's Pope. Certainly, the new pontiff upheld the interests of General Jorge Videla and Admiral Emilio Massera during the Dirty War, and served to suppress all manifestations of liberation theology. And certainly, he can serve to influence policy, including the agenda of neoconservatives, throughout South and Central America. His installation, it has been noted, took place 1 week following the death of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. By the end of 2013, Bergoglio emerged as the most popular cleric on planet Earth, earning an approval rating of 88% among American Catholics, who are just fucking fascist anyway. So that should give you an idea of who he is catering to. Few appear to take heed that Francis is the first pope to be charged with crimes against humanity. So yeah, this is Pope Francis I they're talking about. So very interesting stuff. Definitely something to consider when you think about the nature of the Catholic Church. Let's see. Chapter 9. Il Crack Sindona. Considering the importance and all-consuming nature of the work I was doing at the agency, considering the missionary zeal, sense of elitism, and marvelous camaraderie among my colleagues there, no one can see how easy it would have been for me to drop out of the world and immerse myself exclusively in the cloak and dagger life. And some of my colleagues at the agency did just that. Socially as well as professionally, they clicked together, forming a sealed fraternity. They ate at their own favorite restaurants, they partied up almost only among themselves, their families drifted to each other, so their defenses did not always have to be up. In this way, they increasingly separated themselves from the ordinary world, and developed a rather skewed view of that world. Their own dedicated double life became the proper norm, and they looked down on the life of the rest of the citizenry. And out of this, an inbred, distorted, elitist view of intelligence that held it to be above the normal processes of society, with its own rationale and justification, beyond the restraints of the Constitution, which applied to everything and everyone else. Former CIA Director William Colby, 1978. So that must be a long block quote from him. Who in the U.S. chain of command was responsible for implementing and directing Gladio, Condor, and the strategy of tension? It's hard to believe that these massive operations were orchestrated by a cadre of CIA agents, elite White House personnel, and select congressional officials within a planning room in Langley, Virginia. The undertakings spanned decades and required an ongoing funding of fresh billions from the drug trade and other illicit sources. So yeah, this is another great passage to point out if people act like you're a conspiracy theorist, once again, for saying that the CIA, other intelligence agencies work together with the Vatican, mafias, Freemasons, literal Nazis, various far-right militias in dozens of countries. to assassinate and neutralize left-wing movements, the leaders of those movements, even small-time members of these movements. It's quite literally what they did. Not a conspiracy theory. And I think it's the Michael Prenti quote when he's like mocking a liberal who is incredulous at this kind of fact and says, well, what do you think? These people like wear suits and meet in rooms? It's like, yes, that's exactly what they do. They wear suits, they meet in conference rooms. Sometimes they wear other things. They turn off the recorders, they discuss their plans, and then they implement them. And they have handshake agreements, non-verbal agreements. Like these people have a similar class interest and they do work together in those class interests. If you're not doing that, that's your fault. Moreover, mounting evidence shows that the agency often acted without any input from the executive or legislative branches of the government. After 1948, Congress and the White House remained in the dark about most developments within the agency, including Gladio operations. During the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration directed the CIA to undertake covert activities in Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, and Indonesia, 1957. But even these missions were conducted without consultation with any congressional subcommittee on intelligence. Congress was briefed in advance of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion and several clandestine missions in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. But no evidence has surfaced that either Congress or the White House sanctioned the establishment of Castle Bank and Trust, the Bank of Credit and Commercial International (BCCI), or the Nugenhand Bank, all of which were solely owned and controlled by the CIA for money laundering purposes. So yeah, if you just like give these people a long leash and let them do whatever the fuck they want to accomplish their fascist missions, they will do it. They will open up entire banks, they will control businesses, entire industries even. They will create the global drug trade. In the wake of Watergate and revelations about the CIA's involvement in the toppling of the government of Salvador Allende in Chile, Congress passed the Foreign Assistance or Hughes-Ryan Act in 1974, which stipulated that the president must be personally informed of all covert operations and must endorse a, quote, finding that such operations are necessary for, quote, national security. Do we think that that helped anything? Do we think that that curbed these intelligence agencies at all? Let's see if anybody's in the chat. Hold on. Good morning, our lovely Revolt. Thanks for joining. This next section here is called the Church Committee. Despite this legislation, the CIA continued to engage in subversive undertakings, including the shipment of arms to the rebels in Angola and to the Kurds in northern Iraq. When news of such undertakings began to surface, the Senate established the Church Committee in 1974 to probe into the activities of the CIA. In its final report, the committee upheld the following. The overwhelming number of excesses continuing over a prolonged period of time were due in large measure to the fact that the system of checks and balances created in our Constitution to limit abuse of governmental power was seldom applied to the intelligence community. Yeah, why would it be? They're operating in secret to begin with. Guidance and regulation from outside the intelligence agencies, where it has been imposed at all, has been vague. Presidents and other senior executive officials, particularly the attorneys general, have virtually abdicated their constitutional responsibility to oversee and set standards for intelligence activity. Senior government officials generally gave the agencies broad, general mandates or pressed for immediate results on pressing problems. In neither case did they provide guidance to prevent excesses, and their broad mandates and pressures themselves often resulted in excessive or improper intelligence activity. Congress has often declined to exercise meaningful oversight and on occasion has passed laws or made statements which were taken by intelligence agencies as supporting overly broad investigations. On the other hand, the record reveals instances when intelligence agencies have concealed improper activities from their superiors in the executive branch and from the Congress, or have elected to disclose only the less questionable aspects of their activities. There has been, in short, a clear and sustained failure by those responsible to control the intelligence community and to ensure its accountability. There has been an equally clear and sustained failure by intelligence agencies to fully inform the proper authorities of their activities and to comply with directives from those authorities. Again, another footnoted sentence there. So none of that should be surprising. That is exactly what is expected when you have a fascist government with fascist bulldogs that act as their intelligence agencies. Of course, they're not going to limit them in any way. This next section here is called Beyond the Law. Ignoring the recommendations of the Church Committee and stipulations from the Foreign Assistance Act, President Jimmy Carter, during the Iranian hostage crisis, encouraged the CIA not to inform Congress of its undertakings in Tehran. The agency needed no encouragement. From the time of its creation, it had opted not to inform any elected official of the full scale of its undertakings, including Gladio, let alone the source of its funding. Who then was directing the killings, the terror attacks, and the coups d'etats? Who was sanctioning the transactions with the mafias and the drug cartels? Who was creating the secret armies, the neo-fascist societies, and the bogus banks? The answer in part resides in the strange story of Michele Sindona's purchase of the Franklin National Bank in 1972. Sindona purchased a controlling interest in the bank from Lawrence Tisch, one of the world's richest men. Tisch was the acting chairman and chief executive officer of CBS. He also owned a chain of movie theaters, a cigarette manufacturing plant, a conglomerate of hotels, and a fleet of oil tankers. So this guy is well diversified in all the really wealthy people shit. He's got his hand in everything. During World War II, Tisch served under William Wild Bill Donovan at the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and never severed his ties to the intelligence community. He was a distinguished member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, a Washington, quote, think tank. Think tanks are also notorious. They play probably just as big of a role in all of these clandestine operations as the intelligence agencies themselves. And they're usually like parts of those intelligence agencies are run by them, created by them, but they are pretty much the propaganda wing. So where these people get together to discuss the narratives that they're going to create and then foist upon the populace to justify all their stuff and to keep people sufficiently scared of enemy countries. So this next section here is called The Think Tank. In 1961, the Christian Science Monitor described the CFR as quote, probably one of the most influential semi-public organizations in the field of foreign policy. It noted that the organization is, quote, composed of 1,400 of the most elite names in the world of government, labor, business, finance, communication, the foundations, and the academies. And, quote, has staffed almost every key position of every administration since that of FDR. 14 years later, Rear Admiral Chester Ward, a member of the CFR for 16 years, reported that a powerful clique within the organization sought, quote, the surrender of the sovereignty of the national independence of the United States to create a one world government. So it's wild that like people who were scared of this like new world order, one world government kind of thing, like the anti-globalist people, were usually all the far right idiots, and none of them took any notice of the CIA literally doing what those people thought were the right things to do, like fighting communism, protecting free trade, helping out businesses and rich people, screwing over the working class. It's almost like the people who thought they were the conspiracy, like aware people, were actually the most duped and most propagandized the entire time. Few critics of the CFR were more vocal than Senator Barry M. Goldwater, who wrote in his memoirs, quote, their goal is to impose a benign stability on the quarreling family of nations through merger and consolidation. They see the elimination of national boundaries, the suppression of racial and ethnic loyalties, as the most expeditious avenue to world peace. Their rationale rests exclusively on materialism. After noting that CFR members control both political parties, Goldwater continued, quote, when we change presidents, it is understood to mean that the voters are ordering a change in national policy. Since 1945, 3 different Republicans have occupied the White House for a period of 16 years. 4 Democrats have held this most powerful post for 17 years. With the exception of the first 7 years of the Eisenhower administration, there has been no appreciable change in foreign or domestic policy direction. When a new president comes on board, there is a great turnover in personnel, but no change in policy. Example, during the Nixon years, Henry Kissinger, CFR member and Nelson Rockefeller's protege, who was in charge of foreign policy. When Jimmy Carter was elected, Kissinger was replaced by Zbigniew Brzezinski, CFR member and David Rockefeller's protege. So yeah, again, when Marxists say that there is no difference in presidents or party, this is what we mean. Like quite literally, the personnel, even if they do change, they belong to the same groups and organizations. They have the same very obvious interests. And then the policies very obviously do not change. It's only delusional liberals who go along with the line that Democrats are any different than Republicans. This next section here is Spook Haven. In 1972, when Sindona purchased controlling interest in Franklin National, the CFR was a haven for spooks, spies, diplomats, military officials, and White House dignitaries. Among its members were Allen Dulles, CIA director from 1953 to 61, William F. Buckley, CIA agent and publisher of National Review, Master CIA operatives Robert R. Bowie, Donald Gregg, and Dean R. Hinton, Katharine Graham, CIA advisor and publisher of the Washington Post, Edward Martin, former OSS Deputy Chief of Staff and U.S. Ambassador to Argentina from 1964 to 68, Henry Sturgis Morgan, OSS officer and co-founder of Morgan Stanley. Jacob D. Beam, CIA agent and U.S. ambassador to the USSR from 1969 to 73. General Lyman Lemnitzer, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO from 1963 to 69. Dean Acheson, U.S. Secretary of State from 1949 to 53. Henry Kissinger, U.S. National Security Advisor from 1961 to 73. David M. Kennedy, Sindona's business partner, who served as U.S. Secretary of the Treasury from 1969 to 71. Other members of the prestigious, quote, club at that time were Kingman Brewster Jr., president of Yale from 1963 to 77, Arthur F. Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1970 to 78, Navy Admiral William J. Crowe, Thomas S. Gates, U.S. Secretary of Defense from 1969 to 61, J. Peter Grace, CEO of W.R. Grace and chairman of Radio Free Europe, Henry A. Grunwald, managing editor of Time magazine, Irving Kristol, founder of Encounter, a magazine funded by the CIA, William S. Paley, chairman of CBS from 1946 to 1983, Robert McNamara, a U.S. Secretary of Defense from 61 to 68, and president of the World Bank from 1968 to 1981, Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York from 1956 to 73, and David Rockefeller, CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank and founder of the Trilateral Commission. The list even included the names of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, and Hubert H. Humphrey, his vice president from 1965 to 69. Okay. So these are all people who were part of Franklin National. How did that sentence start off? Sorry. Oh, so it's talking about the CFR. So the Council on Foreign Relations was a haven for these spooks. And all those people I listed were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So again, if that gives you any idea of, like, regardless of party, they all have the same interests. They're all working together, quite literally. This next section here is called The Problem Bank. Lawrence Tisch had been widely hailed as one of the most astute businessmen in American history. Throughout his long career, he rarely made a financial blunder. But in 1972, he acquired, through his Lowe's Corporation, 21.6% of Franklin National, which was based in Franklin Square on Long Island, New York. The acquisition was quaggy from the get-go. I've never heard of that word, quaggy. Maybe it's like quagmirish. On March 6, 1972, federal bank examiners found the bank at the brink of insolvency, with its classified and criticized loans at $211.1 million. The figure represented 11.6% of Franklin's total loans and 91.2% of its capital. Moreover, the purchase of the stock placed Tisch in a compromising position. Being the major shareholder and a member of the board of directors of both the holding company and the bank, he had improper control of Franklin's assets and activities. This, quote, rebuttable presumption triggered a Federal Reserve investigation that might have resulted in criminal charges and a stiff prison sentence. As soon as the investigation got underway, Sindona appeared at Franklin on July 20th, 1972 with hat in hand, offering Tisch $40 a share, $8 above the market value. Sindona was not a second-class mobster, but a world-renowned financier who would not buy a pig in a poke. Yet at the time of the purchase, Franklin was posting a loss of $7.2 million and had been classified as a, quote, problem bank by the Office of the Currency. Why did Sindona suddenly show up with the offer? Why would Sindona take such a massive financial risk for an institution on the verge of collapse? And why was he willing to pay so much more than the bank shares were worth? All very interesting questions. This is something that comes up a lot in Marxist circles, is when you look at things like the Financial Times, when you look at financial press and news that the literal capitalists are most interested in, often you will find facts that are not portrayed in the mainstream media that give you a lot of insight into the interest at hand and cut through all the bullshit and the propaganda, basically. And now if people were inclined enough to look at the share prices and see that this guy who's involved with the Vatican, who's obviously like this high-level mobster and this like wealthy financier and involved with all these high places and powerful people, if people had just bothered to look at why this guy is making this awful deal, it would seem very suspicious, right? Let's see how much time I got left on this one. Oh, we're almost at 20 minutes. Morning, Shibbles. Good to see you. What's up, Peace 979? All right, so I'm just going to switch over to the next book before I get into another section here. Let's see how long it is. No, okay, I will read one more. Sorry. Sorry, guys. A little indecisive today. So this next section here is conspiracy theory. Some writers have speculated that the deal may have been triggered by the animosity between Arthur Roth, who served as the CEO of Franklin National from 1946 to 1968, and David Rockefeller, the CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Roth testified that he ran into trouble with the Rockefeller brothers when he sought to establish a branch office of Franklin National in New York City. He said, starting in 1958, I came into direct personal conflict, not only with David, but with his brother Nelson, and this went on for several years. It first came into the open during hearings on the new omnibus banking bill in Albany in February 1958. A good part of the legislature was present because we'd sent telegrams to each assemblyman and senator the night before, saying that if he wanted to learn the answer to the bank controversy, to come to the legislative chamber the following day. Arthur T. Roth compiled a huge dossier on the shady dealings of the Rockefellers and presented it to reporters when Governor Nelson Rockefeller arrived in California to campaign for the presidency. The wrath of the Rockefellers, according to this scenario, knew no bounds, and they set out to concoct a plan involving Tisch and Sindona that would result in the destruction of Franklin National. Okay, so that will explain that, I guess. And I'm already starting to wonder if Franklin National had anything to do with the Franklin credit ring, or the Franklin credit ring scandal, which is this like notorious case of some people who were like high level, somewhat local politicians, and I think it was Franklin, Tennessee, or something, uh, who were like caught doing like some child trafficking scheme, and then like it was quickly shut down and hushed up, and like as far as I know, people were not held accountable to the degree that they should have been, considering the heinousness of the crime. But anyway, we're going to bookmark the Gladio book there, and we'll pick up tomorrow with the section called The Shadow Game. I'm going to switch over to the Western Marxism book now. So, picking up here, what is most striking in the declarations we have just seen is that they were made in an essay dedicated to, quote, coming to terms with the past. Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit. My German is just as bad as my French, Spanish, Italian, all of them. To take account of Nazism and the horror of the, quote, final solution meant taking one's distance from the anti-colonial revolution. It is the viewpoint of Horkheimer as well, who, as demonstrated by a well-informed scholar and admirer of his in our own time, should be recognized for the merit of having promptly identified the, quote, inhuman essence of imperialism and the line of continuity under the banner of anti-Western imperialism that supposedly runs from the Third Reich through the national and revolutionary movements of the Third World and Third Worldism. That's wild. That's like a wild claim to say that like there is some kind of connection between Western imperialism and the anti-Western imperialism, and that the anti-Western anti-imperialism that supposedly runs from the Third Reich through the national and revolutionary movements of the Third World and Third Worldism. I'm assuming that's got to be what Horkheimer and these Western Marxists are claiming. And again, when you like frame it in this way, it seems obvious. It's as obviously nonsensical as it really does seem. It's like to say that like the West is not the inheritor of fascism, and that these global South movements are because they may have some kind of, I don't know, aspect you don't like. Horkheimer and Adorno began from the assumption that recognizing national differences and demanding respect for them is synonymous with, quote, nationalism, chauvinism, and perhaps even racism. So the discourse on the nation should be situated in an ominous political tradition leading to the Third Reich. Clever, logical game they're playing. In reality, the principal Nazi theorist explicitly condemned, quote, enthusiasm for nationalism in itself. For, quote, the slogan of the right peoples to self-determination serves, quote, all the elements of the inferior races that are on the earth to help them demand freedom for themselves, as did, quote, the Negroes of Haiti and Saint-Domingue. We hear stronger than ever here hatred of the national revolutions of the colonial peoples. The particularly barbaric character of Nazism lay, among other things, in its attempt to construct a colonial empire in the heart of Europe itself, with the intention thereby of abolishing the right to self-determination and of autonomous national existence for even those peoples who had until now been recognized by the international community as a whole. The line of continuity that Adorno fantastically declared erased from history the vaunted pathos of the West to defend at all costs against the rise of colonial peoples of color who had been incited by the Jewish and Bolshevik agitators, as stated in the discourses of Hitler. Yeah, that's exactly the best refutation you could come up with against this bullshit from Adorno or Horkheimer. It's very obvious when you listen to the Nazi rhetoric that they are not fans of third worldist movements, revolutionary Marxist movements. They're not fans of socialism. They're not fans of anti-colonialism. So to try to make any connections between the two is like this desperate projection from the Western Marxists. Horkheimer is the author of a great saying, quote, "Whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should also keep quiet about fascism." Okay, broken clocks. It is the saying that, in a polemic against critical theory itself, could also be reformulated as, quote, "Whoever is not willing to talk about colonialism should also keep quiet about capitalism and fascism." As we will better see below, the removal of colonialism also made any authentic coming to terms with the past impossible. Yeah, it's like trying to look at any kind of systemic problem without looking at the system itself. So this next session or chapter here, chapter 10, Marcuse and the difficult rediscovery of imperialism. Contrary to Adorno, Marcuse supports the Hegelian thesis that the truth is the whole. Given this theoretical assumption, he, in retracing the framework of the liberal West, cannot erase the relations it instituted with the Third World and with the colonial and ex-colonial countries. Quote, "The war in Vietnam has revealed for the first time the nature of the existing society." End quote. The nature for it is innate in expansion and aggression. Vietnam is in no way just one more foreign policy event, but rather connected with the essence of the system. Beyond the, quote, "inhuman and unnecessary violence unleashed on that country, what reveals the oppressive nature of the North American Republic, considered as a whole, is the treatment reserved for the population of colonial origin in the South. Quote, "Murders and lynchings of blacks go unpunished throughout though the criminals are well known. The whole must not lose sight of this either when it examines the problem of wealth and poverty. Quote, the conquest of scarcity is still confined to small areas of advanced industrial society. Their prosperity covers up the inferno inside and outside their borders. It thus hides the areas of poverty in the capitalist metropoles, and above all, the desperate poverty of the colonies and semi-colonies. Therefore, it is essential to recover the categories usually left out of the dominant ideology. Indignation for the, quote, neo-colonial massacres must push us to end colonialism and, quote, abandonment of neocolonialism in all its forms. Above all, quote, the world is experimenting with an imperialism of a reach and a power unexampled until now in history. It is an aggressiveness that threatens not only small countries. Quote, faced with the immense aggressive force of the system of late capitalism and of the United States in particular, Eastern totalitarianism in reality was on the defensive, and indeed it was defending itself desperately. Is he still quoting Marcuse there? Like, is Marcuse actually recognizing that the Eastern, quote, totalitarianism of China, Russia, existing socialist countries, or any anti-imperialist country is actually a defensive move and a defensive structure, not just a competing imperialism? That is my favorite thing that people do nowadays. It's like pretending that, like, when the US and NATO and European countries, whoever, like all collectively together have these joint military bases that they use. There's like 800 to 900 of them. We don't even know how many there really are. And they use this system of military dominance to impose their financial will on other countries and extract capital from them. And then you have countries like China making win-win trade deals that is an alternative to that. And they do it without military force. That's somehow not anti-imperialism. That's just a competing aspirational imperialism. Even though the military force isn't being used, even though there's no like comprador regime that they had to put in place, it's almost like these people desperately want to project the evil that their own system does onto other systems so they can keep people mollified in a sense of, in a state of just doing nothing, like doing absolutely nothing and taking no even like logical or conversational stance. Like, even if rediscovered with difficulty, in an uncertain and oscillating way, the category of, quote, imperialism tended to put in crisis that of, quote, totalitarianism. Marcuse well understood the problems facing the countries weighed down by the colonial yoke. They were inclined toward a, quote, widespread presumption that remaining independent would require rapid industrialization and attainment of a level of productivity. Yeah, you have to build up your productive forces if you want to remain a country and not get immediately taken over by outside forces or inside reactionary forces. But quote, industrialization in these backward areas does not take place in a vacuum. The transformation of underdeveloped into industrial societies must, as quickly as possible, discard the pre-technological forms. And here is the greatest difficulty. Quote, in these same countries, the dead weight of pre-technological and even pre-bourgeois customs and conditions offers a strong resistance to such a superimposed development. Therefore, Marcuse asks, quote, can one reasonably assume that under the impact of the two great systems of total technological administration, the dissolution of this resistance will proceed in liberal and democratic forms? This would be an unrealistic expectation. Quote, on the contrary, it rather seems that the superimposed development of these countries will bring about a period of total administration, more violent and more rigid than that traversed by the advanced societies, which can build on the achievements of the liberalistic era. To sum up, the backward areas are likely to succumb either to one of the various forms of neocolonialism or to a more or less terroristic system of primary accumulation. It's quite a claim. I don't know if it's really played out that way in history. The Soviet Union had found itself in a position not very different from the newly independent countries. We know the dangers from the quote immense aggressive force of the capitalist and imperialist world and imperialist West weighed upon it. In what way could the USSR have confronted the threat? Quote, by the power of total administration, automation in the Soviet system can proceed more rapidly once a certain technical level has been attained. As for the newly independent countries, for the Soviet Union, the choice was between capitulation to colonialism and imperialism and accelerated economic and technological development, which could be accomplished only by sacrificing to a greater or lesser degree the exigencies of democracy. This is also something that Matt Christman used to say a lot on his grill stream. I don't know if anybody here is like a fan of that. I wish he still did them. Obviously, he hasn't been able to do that since he suffered his medical event, but hopefully someday he will get back to being able to do that kind of thing. But he would often say that like the USSR and China now both had to go through this period of exploiting their workers. Like it's just an inevitable thing that you have to do if you want to build up your productive forces. And whether you start calling that capitalism or socialism is all debatable depending on the particulars of the system of government that you're talking about. But he would always like almost sound like a leftcom or like a what do you call it? Like one of these Western Marxists who was when he was like comparing the USSR and Soviet systems and China to the capitalist exploitative systems. He would make it seem like they were all just kind of like equally harsh and just oppressive on their people. I just don't know if that's really the case, but it's what he insisted on. And it seems to be what this last paragraph is kind of getting at too. But as if faced with this conclusion, which emerged from his own analysis, Marcuse retreated, shocked, and not from lack of intellectual courage, but because he did not fully grasp the progressive and emancipatory reach of the world anti-colonialist revolution. He warmly welcomed the struggle for national liberation of the Vietnamese people who, quote, with the poorest weapons can keep in check the most efficient system of destruction of all times, representing, quote, a world historical novelty. More generally, quote, the national liberation fronts can make a precious contribution to the crisis of the system, of capitalism. And yet, causes for doubt were not far behind. Yes, the victory of the Vietnamese resistance, quote, is an immensely positive and constructive step. But, quote, this has nothing to do with the construction of a socialist society. For the newly independent countries, rapid economic and technological development was a question of life and death. However, quote, is there any evidence that the former colonial or semi-colonial areas might adopt a way of industrialization essentially different from the model of capitalism and substantially copied by the Soviet Union? And I do wonder, like the people that I just refer to as generally left comms, ultras, these are the people who, again, describe as like the armchair leftists. It's like the typical, what do you call it, like stereotype, because they, again, are sitting in their comfortable position in the West, benefiting from the imperialism and leveling these critiques at anti-imperialists, like actual practicing anti-imperialist states, leaders, movements, whatever. Um, and I just have to ask, what is it that you would have these people do? Like, what is it that you would have these colonized or formerly colonized countries do differently? Would they just pursue socialism and the production of or the pursuit of productive forces in a way that like you find more comfortable, that you find more amenable to like your own sensibilities, like, and then what right do you have to make that criticism? Like, what is the position that they're making this from? Like, again, from people who are unable to pursue any of that in their own countries or don't even have a burgeoning beginning of a movement to be able to do that. Shibble says, fighting war with war. Yeah, I mean, you do kind of have to engage with the reality as it exists, right? I'll do another 5 minutes on this book. The philosopher who argued in this way was not touched by doubt. Didn't the transcendence of an international division of labor that saw a handful of countries hold a monopoly on technology and on technologically advanced industry to exercise a not purely economic power over the rest of the world have something to do with the realization of a quote way of industrialization essentially different from the past? Okay, so basically they're saying he did have some doubts because he recognized that getting past that system, uh, you have to deal with the reality that a handful of countries do have a monopoly on the advanced industry and tech at that point. And then what? Again, they're basically asking the same question that I just asked. Like, what is the socialist way of overcoming that problem as opposed to the capitalist way? Like, what are the particulars of how you do that in the ideal way that would make the people who living in the West satisfied with it and uncritical of it, I guess. After speaking about the persistent scarcity outside the quote advanced industrial societies as an inferno, Marcuse seemed to consider the reduction of this infernal area irrelevant. He called attention to the scandal of extreme polarization between the comfort of quote advanced industrial society and the desperate misery of the third world, but then argued as if its development was not in any substantial way a novelty or alternative to the existing order. Why should reducing planetary social polarization be less important than reducing it within a single country? We think of the proverbial situation of not seeing the forest for the trees. The result was paradoxical. After having called attention to the conflict between the anti colonial revolution and colonialist and imperialist reaction, unsatisfied by the insufficiently, quote, different and new character of the political and social reality that was emerging, Marcuse invites us to take note that the, quote, world system is by now united for life and death. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty great summation of why I cannot take the Western left seriously because they are doing that exact thing. They're just like making these unfair and very obviously disingenuous criticisms of other movements because they're not sufficiently different from the capitalist system for them to be able to support it. And by support it, of course, we mean with saying nice things in literature, on the internet, like wherever their platforms may exist. So this chapter here, 11, the August 4th of critical theory and of the concrete utopia. If Vietnam was the reason for the rift between the philosophers of critical theory and concrete utopia, their condemnations of the United States intersect and conflict with the declarations of support. Unity was reestablished on the occasion of the Six-Day War, June 5th to 10th, 1967, that saw Israel triumph over Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Certainly, this unity I refer to was far from being set in stone. Horkheimer and Adorno identified so completely with Israel that they did not even worry about defending it from the accusation of colonialism or imperialism that was leveled at that moment by anti-colonialist and third worldist forces. On the contrary, for the two exponents of critical theory, it was a question of putting these very forces on trial as the accused. Yeah, of course these guys are fans of Israel. Can you imagine being like any kind of quote-unquote Marxist or leftist philosopher and then supporting Israel in any way at any point? That should, of course, give you like the most obvious indicator as to what the real motives are. Although on the most immediate political level, Bloch took a very similar position to Horkheimer and Adorno on a different note. He also defended Israel from the accusation of colonialism or imperialism. It is true, he argued, that it was a country that enjoyed the support of the U.S. president, quote, the Johnson of the Vietnam War, itself a colonial and imperialist war. However, we must not confuse different things. Oh man, this is going to be, get popcorn ready for this. In conformity with his style of thought, the philosopher of the quote concrete utopia evoked a bright future under the banner of peaceful coexistence and quote symbiosis between Jews and Arabs. He declared further that he did not recognize himself in Zionism, and he regretted that the founding of Israel happened under the ideology of Herzl, the follower of quote nationalism, who was in no way inclined to the quote symbiosis with the other peoples residing in the territory. And so he explained the injustice that the new state imposes on quote Arab refugees and the quote Arab minority remaining in Israel. Things would have gone very differently if the political line and legacy of the internationalist and quote socialist Moses Hess, were the heir to the great tradition of the Hebrew prophets, had prevailed instead. However, updating a glorious past, one can hope for a quote new symbiosis between Arabs and Jews and even, quote, in case of necessity, in a symbiosis that sees, quote, the autonomy of Israel guaranteed in the context of, quote, an infinitely larger Arab state space. Don't you love when they do that? They just say a whole bunch of words to hint at some kind of fictional and idealistic idea of like, can't we all just get along? And then ignore all the political and material realities and the military realities that go into trying to impose that fiction onto people in the real world. I love when liberals do that. It's my favorite thing. Unfortunately, despite the evocation of a radiant future and perhaps corresponding utopia, things looked quite different as far as the present was concerned. Bloch did not limit himself to totally identifying with Israel. He was not content to merely support the war against Nasser's Egypt. He went further. He accused Nasser of following a, quote, Nazi model, of being inspired by a, quote, hatred against Jews up to the final solution. And all this was with the complicity of the entire Arab world, from which come, quote, mortal threats against Israel. Yeah, so you can see like the Western left is fully on board with the treating anti-Zionism and the anti-colonialism of the people of Palestine, treating that as if it's just fascism and anti-Semitism. Doesn't matter how dishonest and obviously stupid that comparison is. And so the left that in some fashion supported the Arab cause itself emitted, quote, sounds of a pogrom, whether it was aware of doing so. Yeah, you're just unwittingly anti-Semitic if you're anti-colonialist, if you're anti-imperialist, if you're anti-Zionist. So arguing, the philosopher of the, quote, concrete utopia ended up accusing anti-colonialism and third worldism in their entirety, in the same manner as the two exponents of critical theory. It is worth noting that even if they wanted to erase the Palestinian tragedy in the Middle East in those years, colonialism was alive and well, even in its classical form and with racist connotations. Little over a decade earlier, in 1956, Egypt, for having nationalized the Suez Canal, was subjected to a joint attack by Israel, Great Britain, anything but inclined to renounce its empire, and France, which decided to teach Nasser a lesson to consolidate its shaky dominion over Algeria. Notwithstanding the disagreement and the rivalry between Washington and London, if Churchill had called on the West to sustain the presence of England in the Suez Canal, quote, to prevent a massacre of the whites, Eisenhower had lamented that with the nationalization of the Suez Canal, Nasser sought to, quote, overthrow the whites. Clearly, for these two Western statesmen, the Arabs continued to be a part of the Negroid population. We know that the pathos of the white race was anything but foreign to Hitler, but Bloch still had no trouble putting Nasser in the same camp. On the occasion of the 1967 war, the most problematic seemed to be Marcuse. His recommended attitude, quote, does not imply a complete acceptance of the arguments of Israel nor of those of its adversaries. On the one hand, quote, the founding of Israel as an autonomous state can be defined as illegitimate to the extent that it happened thanks to an international accord, on foreign soil and without considering the local population. I admit that to the initial injustice, others have been added on the part of Israel. The treatment of the Arab population was reprehensible, if not worse. Israel's policy has revealed racist and nationalist traits that we Jews should be the first to reject. A third injustice is the fact, I believe incontrovertible, that from the founding of the state, Israeli policy has followed too passively American foreign policy. Never on any occasion have the representatives or the representative of Israel in the United Nations taken a position in favor of the struggle for liberation of the Third World against imperialism. On the other hand, so all these things he just said were like total fact, very obvious reasons why the existence of the state of Israel is totally unjust right from its outset, and how it's based on quite literal genocide and racism. But let's see what he has to say about the other hand when he just gives us a whole word salad as to why we have to still support it. On the other hand, the initial injustice cannot be repaired by a second injustice. See, it's just as bad. Justice is just as bad as injustice, right? The initial injustice cannot be repaired by a second injustice. The state of Israel exists, and a place of meeting and understanding must be found with the hostile world surrounding it. In the second place, we must also consider the repeated attempts at accord made by Israel and always rejected by the representatives of the Arab world. And in the third place, of the declarations, not generic but clear and strong, by Arab spokesmen on wanting to conduct a war of annihilation against Israel. Again, that was just three ways of saying that to undo the initial injustice would be just as bad as the justice. And now that we have committed the genocide and the Nakba and all this stuff. You just have to deal with the fact that Israel exists. There's no undoing that. Sorry, guys. That's just an immutable fact of the universe. Such a tortured calculus of the wrongs and rights seems like it must go hand in hand with doubts and uncertainties. Instead, the conclusion was peremptory. Quote, in these circumstances, the preventive war, as in fact was the war against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, could and must be understood and justified. It was a conclusion entirely based on the assumption of a quote war of annihilation that the Arab states are scolded for. I mean, which they would be totally correct in wanting to wage. Like, they have a reason to denounce the people who are quote the normalizers, the people who like make attempts to like democratically or diplomatically appeal to Israelis or Israeli government and society. It's like that is a failed endeavor. That is going to go nowhere against your genocidal oppressors. So I went long on this one. I'm going to bookmark that one here, and now I'm going to switch over to the third book. I remembered, because I saw Shibble say at the chat at the end of yesterday, that this was the book that I'd already queued up in the library to pick up on. Since we finished the Peter Dale Scott book, I guess the copy I had was not the complete book. So if anybody wants to send me a full copy of Peter Dale Scott's Drugs, Oil, and War, it's about Afghanistan, I can pick back up on that at some point. But for now, let's do The Soviets Expected It by Anna Louise Strong. So let's see. We got the table of contents here. Should I read the foreword? Yeah, it's not very long. It's a page. All right, so the foreword here. Sorry, make it big for my old eyes. Whatever we Americans may have thought of the Soviet people, they hold today our own front line for our democracy, our science, our equality, for all we have ever held dear. On them has fallen the military defense of civilization and human freedom against the dark forces that threaten to put back the clock of the world. Whether the Russians wanted it or whether they didn't, whether they intrigued with Hitler or shrewdly took time and territory for final defense, when the mortal hour struck, they met it with the unity and valor unique among the battling nations. In taking up the challenge handed them by, they have made it necessary for us to understand the Soviet people if we would save ourselves. Most of all, we must know that the Soviets expected it and got ready for it, and that they see a way through, not only to their own victory, but to the great peace of the peoples, based on equality of all races and nations, on free access by the world's people to the world's resources, on democratic choice. For unless we understand that tremendous hope unless we understand the tremendous hope that rallies the Soviet people to this conflict, we shall not only fail our strongest ally, but may lose the battle for ourselves and for the world. So is she writing this like during World War II before it's over? And, like as the Soviets have like just started to kick Hitler's ass, I guess. Shibbles will probably let me know in the chat. So chapter 1, Russians are people. Who would have thought? I never fell for this talk about the quote mystery of Russians. Russians are people, like Americans, like Chinese. People are very much alike and also very different. Whether you stress the likeness or the difference depends upon your aim. Hitler preaches the superior race of Germans. The American Declaration of Independence asserts that all men are created equal, while Jesus Christ proclaimed that we are all alike sinners and sons of God. The Russians never wanted to be a mystery. When I first went to Moscow 20 years ago this autumn, they were explaining themselves in tomes of Marxist logic to all who would hear. Most people wouldn't. They called the explanations propaganda. When they were more polite, they called them dreams, as H.G. Wells did with Lenin's mad dream of electrification, propounded in the dark night of the Civil War. After a while, the Russians stopped explaining. They let their actions speak. It kind of sounds stereotypically Russian. Oh no, tell me I can't edit this one. Can I? Okay, good. Today their actions shout to a world in battle. They shout from the world's front lines. In the hot flame of those actions, a thousand myths about the Soviet land are shriveled. The myth of Russian backwardness, the myth of machine-like regimentation, the myth of a discontented peasantry burning to overthrow the Stalin regime. When the ultimate test of war tried the European peoples, the chief difference that appeared was that the Soviet people showed a unity, efficiency, and courage beyond others, and a more spectacular resistance to Hitler than any other land. They set alight a hope and confidence in final victory that seemed to have died from the continent of Europe. I think what took me to Russia in the first place was that Russia seemed to continue and broaden the American tradition, not the tradition of today's supremely productive and somewhat disillusioned America, but that of the America I knew before the First World War. In that Western land of my childhood, a penny bar of candy was considered a treat. Standards of living were crude as compared with today. But the one unforgivable crime was to fail to believe in human progress and to fail to boost it along as it came. Today in the USSR, the standard of living is crudely simple, but the people have the faith that if you that you search for almost but the people have the faith that you search for almost in vain among the little lands of Europe. It is the faith that we human beings, by the twin tools of human cooperation and science, are able to conquer all problems presented by nature, even the problem of our own very backward souls. Yeah, I mean, I always tend to think about. I think I heard about it on Prolspod in the first place was Soviet time capsules, and if you just look them up in Google, it's like so depressing because they were so full of hope. They thought that we were going to be like living on space stations or other planets by now because they thought that we were just going to see this unprecedented and uninterrupted forwarding of human progress, and that simply didn't happen because mostly because of the U.S. empire in the Cold War. As we keep explaining, it has quite literally held humanity back by generations and may end up dooming all of humanity to climate change driven extinction. Faith in a future grows in part from access to great natural resources. Thus, it came to us Americans in the days when my forebears settled the Connecticut Valley and drove on westward, seeking always the untamed land and the far horizons. Some of the similarities I have seen between Russians and Americans derive, I think, from a similar geography. American engineers who helped build the great industrial enterprises of the first 5-year plan often remarked that only the USSR and the USA have space adequate for mighty mass production within their own frontiers, and that this creates the sense of powerful and peaceful expansion. When I came to Leningrad, when I come to Leningrad district and the woods of Soviet Karelia, it is always like a return to my homeland of Puget Sound. The same endless forests pierced by a thin line of lonely railway, the same lavish use of timber and long rail fences across a rain-soaked wilderness. The people taming this wilderness wear shabby but durable clothes of the logger and miner, and know how to make camp under any conditions like the men I knew in my youth. In the Crimea, I am reminded of the blue skies and sunny hills of California, close to blue water. The Crimean Tartars build against their climate homes of brightly painted clay, not very different from the adobe huts our Mexican farm laborers build. Just makes me think of like how necessary that skill to make camp in any weather might start to become useful again soon. Kazakhstan recalls the great arid plains of Arizona, where here and there the touch of irrigation brings beautiful crops. Finally, the great Siberian plains, which lead to perpetual snow on the mountains at Lake Baikal, always recall the North Dakota plains and Montana uplands through which I have traveled so often in the snow peaks of our northwest. Or to the snow peaks of our northwest, sorry. Quote, Russians and Americans farm, the little nations of Europe garden, said Harold Ware, who brought the first American tractor unit to Russia in the Great Volga Famine of 1921 to 22. Quote, this gives to Russians and Americans a similar expansive mentality. He added that the North Dakota boys who came with him to teach the Russians to run tractors noticed that Russian peasants had a brand of humor similar to their own, quote, a kind of rough but non-malicious practical joking. He said further, quote, Russian farm boys have never seen tractors, but as soon as they see what a tractor will do, they have the same itch to get their hands on one and the same joyous recklessness in driving them that American boys have with the family car. Hilarious. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like they are just like people who are probably just as intelligent as you, if not more so. And once you see what a tractor does, you're like, oh yeah, that's incredibly. I need to get my hands on that shit. I like to think that today, some of the Russian humor produced by the war resembles our American brand. It is not like British humor, based on understatement. It is based on cheerful guying and picturesque brag. Uh, like Lazovsky's remark, quote, Hitler will see the Kremlin, but only on a picture postcard. Or his other statement, quote, the German army has started for Vladivostok. I suppose I should wish them a pleasant trip, for it will surely be a long one. I think Americans will laugh as the people of Moscow did, when they see the Soviet newsreel in which a German prisoner of war is made to disgorge his loot and brings up last of all, after carefully unfolding the package, 2 bars of laundry soap. I am sure that the Russians would get the full flavor of that typically American slogan, "Cheer up, the worst is yet to come." That's funny. I've never heard that American slogan, but it sounds very appropriate for today too. If I find many ways in which Russians resemble Americans, my Chinese friends tell me that the Russians are like Chinese. I suppose that Russians, or let us be accurate now and say, quote, the Soviet people, are composed of so many nationalities that they have points of resemblance to most of the peoples in the world. In one of their early censuses, they listed 182 different peoples, speaking 149 different languages. The USSR is a melting pot of diverse nations, each with its own language, race, history, culture, religion, and political development. They range from recently nomad shepherds like the Kazakhs and the Kalmucks to peoples of highly sophisticated culture like Armenians, Ukrainians, and Jews. A little bit of sounds like stereotypical stuff there, but I don't know. I mean, it sounds like they're also speaking in just like historical fact. But it would certainly not go over well if you said that kind of thing today. They include Eskimos. You can't even say Eskimo. It's a slur too. They include Eskimos of the Arctic and Uzbeks of so they include Inuit of the Arctic and Uzbeks of Central Asia, where less than 20 years ago the girls were sold in marriage and kept behind black veils or in harems all their lives. Russians are not only people; they are lots of different peoples. The revolution of 1917 knocked the shackles off all these different peoples and made them all equal citizens of the USSR. It set them all rushing in a mad speed of progress from the Middle Ages, or the primitive nomadic era, or wherever else they started. Toward the 20th century and perhaps the 21st, all of these different peoples have about as much local autonomy as our 48, quote, sovereign states. Okay, so yeah, they're writing this before there was even Alaska and Hawaii. Crazy. If you get that picture, it will not surprise you to find that almost anything, any terrible backwardness or stupendous achievement, might be true somewhere in the USSR. Titanic progress exists in the midst of old backwardness, a jumble of 4 centuries at once. I met farm women from northern Siberia who had never seen a railway train until they went to Moscow as deputies to the Soviet Congress, senators from their districts no less. They were able women who had organized schools and hospitals in a dozen counties. They could tell you how badly the men used to run things in the old days when it was manly to get drunk and beat your wife. They could tell you sharply how badly. Yeah, sorry, I screwed that one up. I've sat in a managerial conference on a big state farm of a couple of 100,000 acres in the Ukraine. It had a 3-shift division of labor and more tractors and harvesters than any farm in America has. But the problem that evening was the difficulty of fixing the change in the night shift in the complete absence of clocks. Crazy. Americans in Moscow hotels often grumble over atrocious plumbing, yet Moscow has also the most scientific garbage disposal in the world. All the waste of this great city of more than 4 million people is first used in, quote, biothermal processes, which heat large, quote, greenhouse farms from underground. When the garbage and sewage is thoroughly rotted in this quite odorless manner, it is then used as fertilizer for ordinary farming. This amazing development got no advertising whatever. I merely chanced upon it when I visited a farm. That actually reminds me of how much like China does environmentally, and if anyone in the West has any idea of it at all, it's always tagged with "at what cost." They literally think they're doing some great environmental stuff, but like at the cost of like um, I don't know, like their own people, like human life. They're always thinking that they're paying some kind of like massive toll because they can't imagine that like there's actually a government system or economic system or a system of political economy that could work better than the Western fake democratic model, the neoliberal model. I gotta block this spot here. Sorry, guys. On the same afternoon, I stopped at the Moscow Central Telegraph and saw some 20 people drawing up their quote photo telegrams to send to their friends. This is something that Western Union does not yet offer to ordinary Americans, yet it occurs in a country which has periodic shortages of clothing and shoes. Yeah, that's also something that people, I think, I probably isn't even true about modern China today, but it's like they do have like these weird conveniences that people here can't have. Like I think a lot about how hard it is to like send money around the US. It's like you have to get money orders, cashier's checks, like you have these avenues and options of like state run things, but then there's also like the private avenues now. You have like the services like Venmo or Cash App. Um, but it's like people even in Europe, they can just like text people money from one bank to another. It's like super easy. And I'm like, I don't know if anybody in the chat knows like what is the difference that goes on in Europe, but like I assume banks are also private institutions there, but maybe they're just a little more regulated by the state. Like, why is it they're able to just send money so easily to people and we have to sign up for all these various apps and services? It's like it's a whole runaround here and it's really annoying. Not gonna lie. All right, I am at an hour, but I'll go just a little bit lower, a little bit more on this book. In a land of such contrast, it is not surprising that many misconceptions arise. Whenever I hear, for instance, that old charge that the Soviets attack religion, I recall the vast varieties of religions I have seen in that land. They include, of course, all the various religious wars, uh, in the Caucasus between Turks and Armenians, and the religious practices of Central Asia, where barely 10 years ago the Mohammedan mullahs incited the people to cut girls to pieces for the sacrilege of advocating women's rights. Yep, reactionary beliefs go around. I shall leave it to my friend, the Dean of Canterbury, as a specialist in religion, to convince you, if he can, that the Soviet system is, quote, more Christian than our capitalist world. I shall leave it to to constitutional lawyers to decide how far freedom of religion can be given by a constitution. The Soviet constitution, as President Roosevelt has made clear, guarantees it as explicitly as ours. I content myself with one episode of a quote attack on religion, as typical as any I know. In the 1930 drive for collective farming, I visited Molvitino County in Ivanovo province, a typical Russian rural district, if anything, quote, typical exists. I sat in a congress of young folks who were organizing the most tremendous flax sowing ever seen in those northern parts. They did it under the slogan of, quote, beating the Holy Helena, the patron saint of flax. Saint Helena, the flaxen-haired, was mother of Emperor Constantine, and the region's chief saint. Her festival, apparently superimposed on that of some earlier pagan goddess, fixed the proper religious day for sowing flax. With the gradual retarding of the Russian church calendar through centuries, this date came 2 weeks later than the time that the Department of Agriculture thought would bring the best results. Under the old system of peasant farming, nothing could be done to change the quote flax sowing day. The priests and the older peasants held out for a holy Helena, and the old men ruled the family farms. The younger educated lads got their first chance when collective farming came. They had a vote on the farm as a good and maybe a bit better than anybody else. Well, sorry, they had a vote on the farm as good and maybe a bit better than anybody else. They mobilized every kind of publicity, mass meetings, leaflets, slogans, and got most of the districts sown early against the denunciations of the priests. The young farmers held a meeting to celebrate the quote victory of science, and then sat tight and waited anxiously to see what the weather would do. Science is not infallible, and weather is not perfectly predictable. Unreasonable frost might have sent the whole county back to quote religion, with the priests all chortling, we told. Perhaps not all of the young folks, and certainly not their fathers, had broken with the holy Helena in the secret depths of their souls. Fortunately for science, the warm spring rains came just after the early planting, and those who planted betimes had the biggest crop ever seen. With shouting and singing, the young farm leaders grabbed the county's single auto truck and started for the provincial capital to report success. I went with them all night through the rain, through the mud, through the dark. When the gasoline was gone, they made an outraged station master let them on a freight train and wrote up their report sitting on a flat car in alternating sun and rain. Plastered with mud and walking the last 4 miles, they banged into the provincial capital, one of the first proud counties to report. Nothing they knew would ever stop them now. Religion, uh, uh, religion, alias the Holy Helena, was gone. Every rural district in Russia had similar conflicts. 20 years ago, the priest induced the peasants to stone the first tractors as, quote, devil machines. Hilarious. Today, the traditional bearded, illiterate, superstitious Russian peasant has practically vanished. For quite a while, the New York newspapers have turned down pictures of Soviet farmers, since they don't look like peasants anymore. Peasants have been replaced by these new, young, somewhat crude but thoroughly confident people who, for 20 years, have been growing in the womb of the Soviet land. The task of all revolutions is to make new people. Only so does the revolution, in the end, succeed. What are they like? What are they like? These quote Soviet people. All right, so I'll bookmark it there. But obviously, feel free to read ahead if anyone wants to. Like I said, the links are in the description. As always, if you go to youtube.com/@tcotepod/streams, you can catch up on all the reading hours. They're all still up there. Or you can just wait for them to be broadcasted in audio format. But in the description of those is the links to the Google documents for all of these texts that I'm reading through. So feel free to read along, read ahead, send them to other people, get people interested in these, because the only reason I'm doing this is because I feel like this is important information. It interests me. Hopefully it explains more of the world that you live in for you, because it certainly provides some context for me. So